Good morning, everyone. Very good to see all of you here this morning. It's good to see new faces as well. So for those of you who are first time in MEC, welcome to MEC. If you need to know more about our church service, and in fact for those of you who are also returning members to MEC, there's that Linktree QR code in front of you beside the Do It Now QR code. You scan that and you actually get yourself updated with everything that's going on in MEC. Even if you need prayer, right? And I know some of you have my personal phone number, maybe some of you don't, but you need prayer urgently. You can scan that QR code and there's actually a button that says that says I need prayer. You click that, key in your prayer request, we'll actually get in touch with you. So use that QR code for your benefit because it will help you stay updated and also stay connected with our congregation. Now, it's very good to be back here to share with you from the word of the Lord. And this morning, we will be looking at just 4 verses from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. So, if you can, do keep your Bibles open because we will be, referring to the scriptures quite a bit. But from these 4 verses, there are just 2 lessons that we are going to pick out this morning. And these 2 lessons are probably lessons that might not be new lessons or something, fresh, but it might be just lessons that we have probably heard before, maybe even from my past sermons. But I think there is a reason why Paul repeatedly emphasizes on, similar lessons and goes a little bit deeper into what is important. And I think it's because these are important lessons of the faith. And these are what we would call the pillars of our Christian faith. And if we don't practice these things that we're going to look at today, then I guess we really need to ask ourselves the question, why do we exist as a Christian? And most importantly, why do we exist as a church? Now, like I said, it's very simple, and we're going to start off with one very simple lesson that Paul is sort of repeating once again, and that is the lesson to love one another. I believe this message or this teaching on loving one another is something that we have heard many times. But what else can we learn about loving one another? Or what other ways we can remind ourselves, let's put it in this way, on the importance of loving one another. Now, if you look at verses 9 to 10, this is what Paul commends the Thessalonian church, right? And in verse 9, this is what he says. Now, about your love for one another, we do not need to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love each other. And in fact, you do love all of God's family throughout Macedonia. Yet we urge you, brothers and sisters, to do so more and more. Now, I hope you all remember last week we talked about how Paul kept repeating, right? You must do more of this, do more of that. And in this week's passage, there is also that repetition where he asks and calls the Thessalonian Christians to do more, right? And now in the aspect of loving one another, he tells them, do more. But there is also a commendation. Now, Paul is very careful to add in a disclaimer there, right? You see, in verse 9, he actually tells them, hey, I'm not telling you to do more because you're not doing anything. You're not loving one another at all. He says, no, you guys are doing great actually, right? And in verse 10, he also says, because we have seen, right, you do love all of God's family. So you're doing great, right? Keep up the good work, but you can do more. And why you can do more is because Paul says, your love is a love that comes from God. You look at what he says in verse 9, right? For you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another. And what he's commending the Thessalonian Christians is he's commending them for their genuine Christianity. And not just genuine because in terms of their actions, they were really genuine, but he was commending them for their genuine experience of God. Because they were so willing to pursue God, because they were so invested into this relationship with God. It's because they took their relationship with God and their faith really seriously, they actually experienced God. And because they had this experience of God, not just a religion that they picked up along the way because someone shared with them this wonderful religion, but they truly had an experience of God. What they shared later on was not religion, but rather an experience of God. When we talk about love and to love one another, I've always said this: it needs to come from a point where we experience God first. You cannot show love to one another if you yourself have not experienced love. And that goes for all Christians of all different levels. If you've been a Christian long enough and you find it really hard to start loving one another, right, or loving others in the way that God has intended you to love, then it's not about questioning what am I not doing right, but rather it's going back to that whole initial question of, am I still experiencing God in my life? And this is what Paul emphasized when he taught the Thessalonian Christians about loving one another. You have experienced God, and now to do more, you need to keep experiencing God. I've said this once before. We all cannot serve from a point of emptiness, right? A car cannot run on empty. And that's the same with us as Christians. We cannot expect to show love to others if we ourselves have zero experience of the love of God. This applies to second generation, third generation Christians. You cannot expect to maintain the faith that your parents passed down to you if you have not had a genuine experience of God yourselves. And that's why Paul here emphasizes on a genuine faith, experiencing the love of God. And when you can experience the love of God, you will know how to love. And when you know how to love, this is where Paul says to them, you can do even more now, right? And when he talks about doing more, what is he trying to tell the Thessalonian Christians to do, right? So he's telling them, you're doing great, you're doing enough, but now do more. And when he says do more, it means this first: persevere. Persevere in love. Love even when people are difficult to love. Paul was sort of giving a prophecy to the church that there will come a time that you need to love people of different backgrounds, different cultures. And there's a reason that he's telling them you need to do more in love. Because right now, the church is a microcluster of house churches. Right now, it's rather comfortable, right? Because it's probably close relatives gathering together for a church service, or good friends or neighbors that you are accustomed to. It's small microclusters of house churches. It's easy to love people whom you are familiar with. But Paul is telling them, do more, because there will come a time where the church will expand, where it will no longer be microclusters of people that you are familiar with, but it will be people of different backgrounds, different skin color, different culture. And in that day, you must learn to love people the way Christ loves all people. Do more. Love even more when the circumstances are increasingly harder. The church in Thessalonica was not exactly facing, comfortable times, right? Like I've mentioned repeatedly, their church was a church that was heavily persecuted. And the persecution was not reducing, it was only increasing. And so Paul says, when the persecution increases, what will your response be? Will you draw further away from God? Will you isolate yourselves even more? Or when persecution and difficulties increase, will you love people all the more as much as you love God? And so Paul was challenging them to take their love for God and love for people to that next level. Do more. Increase in your love. Persevere in your love, right? Even though the community around you hates you increasingly, even though the community and society around you is increasingly more and more hostile towards you, as a Christian, what are you going to do? Are you going to recluse yourself, reduce in your love, or are you going to do the most Christian thing ever, that is to increase in your love? The next thing that when Paul tells them to to do more is to practice love, right? And when Paul tells them to practice love, what does this mean? I like to say this, love is not a gift. Sometimes we think some people are more gifted to love others, right? Oh, the pastor is 100% given this gift to love people. The next is the church leaders, right? The LCEC members, gifted to love people. Well, there's no such thing, the gift of love. Because love is a spiritual practice. It's a spiritual discipline that everyone can cultivate. And the more we practice love, the more we will be perfected in love. That's what Paul says in one of his other epistles, right? Love for others, love the way Christ loves us. This can only abound and increase if you practice it more and more. And so Paul is calling on the Christians to practice more love, right? Don't tell yourself, well, I'm gifted with love. God has planted love in my life, so I don't need to practice love, right? It will happen naturally. It will happen automatically. Paul says, no, you need to practice love. Loving people who are difficult will not come naturally. You have to be intentional in doing that, just as God and Jesus was really intentional in showing us His love. And likewise, we too must be intentional in showing love to one another. Practice it, and the more you practice, the more you love, the easier it becomes. The more we practice love, the more our love will be perfected. And so I would like us to pause for a moment to ponder on, as we have heard, all these marvelous points about love, right? I think as a church, we need to ponder and ask ourselves these few questions. Are we a church that is infused with God's love? What does it mean to be infused with God's love, right? It means first of all, we ourselves have a genuine experience of God's love. I like how one kid kept emphasizing today is a Spirit-filled Sunday. But I believe every Sunday, every day of the week is also a Spirit-filled day where the Lord is with you and His presence fills you so much. And that's what it means to be infused with an experience of God, right? You see, tea. How many of you love tea here? I don't love tea. I'm not a tea guy because tea is too bland for my liking, right? No offense to those who love tea. But tea somehow just doesn't give you that kick, But, I've been to India. And India actually sort of made me love tea a little bit more. I've been to India close to 7-8 years now. This year, I just decided I would take a pause from India because it's a little bit too busy. But India kind of sparked my love for tea because the way they make tea over there is so flavorful, right? Apparently, they steep the tea hours before they serve you. And that's why their masala tea or their teh tarik, it's really nice. And they don't just put tea leaves and milk, right, and sugar. They have a blend of spices that they infuse and brew it together. And it brings out this really flavorful tea, right? Now, so I did what every tourist would do, right? You drink the tea, it's really good. You talk to the local there. Where can you get this nice tea? And he tells you what brand to buy. He tells you the place to buy. And I went and I bought the tea, right? Brought it back, and I tried to brew the tea, the same way the Indians did. But I found out the taste was not as good, or it was way below the standard of what I had over there. And what was wrong? What was the missing ingredient, right? And the thing is this, I don't have the time here like they did have over there. Over there, it's the housewives who made these really nice tasting teas, and they really put in the effort. And I think there's also that, that touch of love that you just cannot get as a guy trying to brew tea over here. There's that unique touch, that really makes the tea flavorful and tasty. And one drink of the tea, it just tastes different. And over here, as much as I try to infuse and make the tea as nice as I could, unfortunately, I failed miserably. So maybe I need to go back to India again to have some of that good tea. But I think our Christian life is also like that, right? You will know the difference between someone who merely has religion or a church that merely practices religion. Between a church that truly is infused with the love of God, where every Christian sitting in the chairs has had a genuine experience of God. There will be a difference. And I pray that our church will not just be a nice religious institution. I pray that we will not be just known for, rather comfortable chairs, good sound, good lighting, nice ambience, or even good coffee. I pray above all these things, we will be known to be a church that is genuinely infused, flavored by the love of God. Amen? That's what we should strive to be. And that's how we can be salt and light in this community, in this area that we are placed in. Be a church that's infused with the love of God. Don't decrease in love. Increase in love. Times are going to get more difficult, more challenging. But I think the challenge for us then, as times get more difficult, we increase in love. The next thing that Paul teaches is a rather interesting lesson, a lesson that we don't really find anywhere else in Paul's letters. Maybe the points, the principles within this point is found elsewhere. But this particular phrase alone, Paul never really mentions it in any of his other epistles. And he tells the Christians, well, one way that you identify as a Christian is if you live a quiet life. It's really interesting. Let's look at what Paul is trying to say here, right? In verse 11, he says here, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your own hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. Really straightforward message, really simple, but sometimes it is not what we think it is. Paul is definitely not asking the Christians, when he says live the quiet life by all means, he's not asking the Christians to live in isolation. Because the Christians, because of the nature of what was going on in their city and their town, were already isolating themselves from the society quite a bit. So he's not telling them isolate yourself even more, right? He's definitely not telling the Christians to live the selfish life as well. When I talk about the selfish life, I think the best way to understand it is our culture today. We live in a culture that, is increasingly placing emphasis on the self, right? Me first, then everyone else next. And if my needs, my desires, my wants are not met, then I focus on myself and increasingly focus on myself before I care or focus on others. And that is the culture or the world that we live in today. And Paul is certainly not placing emphasis or telling the Christians, as when he says live the quiet life, to live the selfish life, right? The quiet life is also not what we think it is, where Paul is telling the Christians, all right, live in a different way, right? Be very quiet, be very zen. That's not what Paul is saying. Right? This is not something you do to show others or for others to admire you. Wow, this Christian can really stay quiet for 8 hours a day. What is the secret to his peace and his calmness and his zenness, right? That's not what Paul is telling the Christians to do. But when he says to the Christians, live a quiet life, basically 3 principles he's trying to bring about to them that makes up the quiet life. The first is to live quietly. It seems like he's repeating himself, but he's not. Because this instruction to live quietly is connected with that phrase or that instruction where he says, mind your own affairs. In simpler terms, mind your own business. Even simpler terms, more localized term, don't be a busybody. That's what he's telling the Christians to do. Mind your own affairs. Live quietly. As Christians, don't be a busybody. Because the culture back then was a culture of gossip, conflict, and arguments, right? If you know the culture back then, there's wells, right? Watering holes where people go and collect water. The well is usually a place where you get your local news, you get your updated news, you get the gossips. You also go there to argue and stir up conflict with one another. The well or the city centers, certain street corners were actually known to be places of judgment, where people, not official judges, but people, man-made judges, man-appointed judges would sit at these street corners, gather an audience and actually pass down judgment on people. That would actually work and take effect because of what? The power of the community, power of society. They didn't need social media. They just needed someone really influential to sit in the street corner and say, hey, that guy stole my money. So from now on, every one of you, label him a thief. If you see him walking by, you can cast a stone at him. You can spit at him because he stole my money. He's a thief. That person hasn't even been caught or even been condemned in the official courts. But because there was someone here shouting in the street corner that he's a thief, that guy has already been judged, proven guilty, even before, any official judge has passed down a judgment. And so when Paul says, live quietly as a Christian, what he's telling the Christians to do is to be part of society, to be part of community. But don't follow the social norms that was happening during your time. Because as a Christian, if you know truth, then you must live in truth, walk in truth, and stand up for truth. And so Paul is telling the Christians, be different. Show yourself to be different in this community, in this society. Don't involve yourself in gossip. Don't involve yourself in anything that disrupts the peace or creates conflicts between people. Be a Christian that stands out by living quietly. The next thing that Paul talks about when he says, live a quiet life is to work with your own hands. This is a principle that we have probably heard of in the epistle of Colossians, where Paul speaks about working hard, working efficiently, working honestly. And he's sort of repeating this same lesson over here, right? Living a quiet life means you do your best. You don't involve yourself in issues or petty issues that doesn't really, that doesn't really bother you, right? But rather you do what God has called you to do. Work hard, right? Don't involve in quarrels, arguments, conflicts, gossips. The next thing, work hard. Work with your own hands. When you are given work, what Paul is trying to say, work with your own hands, is this. When you are given work, don't ask someone to do your work. Do your own work. That's how a Christian should live. Very simple, practical lessons. Don't pass your work that you are supposed to do, that you are being paid for, right? Don't pass it on to someone else. You do your own work. That's what it means to be a Christian, a God-fearing, a God-honoring Christian. Do your own work, right? So work honestly, work diligently, and as you work to produce results as well. You see, Paul, when he says work with your own hands, what it means, when you do work with your own hands, you will put in the effort, right? And when you put in the effort, you will see results. And when you see results, Paul says, keep working, keep doing even better, so that your work is increasingly efficient, so that people will see, wow, Christians are not lazy. Christians are hard workers, honest workers. Work, if you look at all of Paul's letters when he talks about working, right, is actually a very practical and spiritual discipline that every Christian should adopt and should practice in their life. Work hard, work efficiently, work diligently. The quiet life comprises finally of this one last principle: walk properly, right? Look at what Paul says here in verse 12. So that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. And when Paul says walk properly, he's not talking about the way you walk, your posture. That's not what he's talking about. But rather he's referring to how you carry yourself as a Christian in the public spaces. Basically, when Paul says live the quiet life, what he is emphasizing on is your actions must always be louder than your words. Or, if not louder, your actions must be consistent with your words. What you preach is what you do. What you ask others to do is what you yourself are doing. Walk properly before others, carry yourself, live your life in a manner that is pleasing before God and in the sight of men. Not just Christians, but even those who are not Christians. Be a genuine Christian. And part of walking properly, what Paul is trying to bring across to the Christians is this message of be genuine, in the sense, be consistent in your private and public life. Don't be someone else in church and another person outside of church. You know, and that is a challenge in itself, right? Sometimes we feel the need to turn off the Christian mode when we are in our workplaces. But the Bible really doesn't give us an option or an on-off button for our Christian life. In nowhere in the Bible does it say, well, there's a switch that God implants into you the day you become a Christian. The moment you step out of church, a few hours after that, you can sort of switch off that switch and not be a Christian. The Bible doesn't really give us this option. The Bible tells us, and the Bible basically only gives us one choice, and that is you be Christ and you be like Christ in and out of church, in your private or in the public spaces of life. This is what it means to live the quiet life. Do we live a quiet life? I'm not referring to those who are still working from home. I'm not referring to those who are living alone. I'm referring to in the general sense of living the quiet life. Are you living the quiet life where my action speaks louder than my words? Or maybe my actions are consistent with my words. Let's spend some time to pray and talk to God.